In a quiet corner of the world, nestled between lush green hills and thick, whispering forests, lay a small but thriving kingdom. The people called it Eldoria, a place where peace had reigned for decades under the wise rule of King Aldrich. He was a fair and just ruler, loved by his subjects for his kindness and respected for his strength. His kingdom wasn't the largest or the richest, but it was prosperous because everyone followed the laws enforced by the king's legendary royal guards. The royal guards were more than just soldiers. They were symbols of power and order. Clad in crimson uniforms trimmed with gold, their presence commanded respect wherever they went. Villagers often gathered around fires at night to share stories about their bravery. Some tales spoke of how they single-handedly stopped entire gangs of bandits. Others whispered of their unmatched skill in swordplay, claiming no one could best them in combat. These stories weren't exaggerations. The guards truly lived up to their reputation. They trained tirelessly, patrolled diligently, and protected the kingdom with unwavering loyalty. Life in Eldoria moved at a steady pace. Farmers worked their fields, merchants filled marketplaces with goods from distant lands, and children played freely without fear. It seemed like nothing could disrupt this harmony. But as any wise person knows, even the calmest seas can hide storms beneath the surface. On the outskirts of the kingdom lived three men who didn't quite fit into the peaceful rhythm of life. Their names were Finn, Bram, and Rolf, and if there was trouble brewing, chances are they were involved. Finn was the brains of the group, or so he liked to think. Quick-witted and always coming up with schemes, he often talked his way out of sticky situations. Bram, on the other hand, was all brawn and very little brain. Strong enough to lift a cart with his bare hands, he relied on Finn and Rolf to tell him what to do. Then there was Rolf, the self-proclaimed mastermind. He fancied himself smarter than he actually was, often overcomplicating simple plans until they fell apart. These three spent most of their days lounging around the local tavern, drinking cheap ale and dreaming of grand adventures that would make them rich and famous. They envied the wealthy merchants passing through town and resented the hard-working villagers who earned their living honestly. To them, life felt unfair, and they believed the only way to change their fortunes was to take matters into their own hands. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows of the dimly lit tavern, the trio sat huddled together at their usual table. Empty mugs littered the surface, and the air smelled of stale beer and roasted meat. "We're wasting our lives here," Finn muttered, leaning forward conspiratorially. "There's gold out there waiting for us. We just need to grab it." Bram nodded enthusiastically, cracking his knuckles. "Yeah, let's rob someone big. Someone important." Rolf smirked, tapping the side of his nose. "Leave it to me. I've got an idea. A plan so clever, even the king's guards won't see it coming." What none of them realized was that their reckless ambition would soon lead them down a path they couldn't turn back from. Little did they know, the king's guards weren't just skilled warriors. They were also patient hunters. And when provoked, they never forgot a face. The tavern was alive with the hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of tankards as villagers unwound after a long day. But at one corner table, Finn, Bram, and Rolf weren't there to relax. They were plotting. The flickering light from the oil lamps cast shadows on their faces, making them look more sinister than they probably intended. Finn leaned in close, his voice low but excited. "Listen up," he said, tapping the wooden table for emphasis. "There's a caravan coming through next week. It's carrying gold, real gold coins, from the capital to the southern province. That's our ticket." Bram scratched his head, confused. "Gold? What are we gonna do with gold?" Finn rolled his eyes. "We're going to take it, you dolt. Think about it. No more working odd jobs or begging for scraps. We'll be rich. We can buy whatever we want. Food, ale, even a house if we feel like it." Rolf grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "And I've already figured out how we'll do it." He grabbed a mug of spilled ale and started drawing lines on the sticky table with his finger. The caravan will pass through the forest road, a narrow path surrounded by trees. Perfect spot for an ambush. We jump out, scare the guards, grab the gold, and vanish before anyone knows what happened. Finn nodded slowly, liking the sound of the plan. It's risky, but it could work. The guards won't expect trouble. They'll think they're safe because it's such a quiet route. Bram frowned, still unsure. But aren't those king's guards supposed to be really tough? Like, unbeatable tough. They're just men, Rolf scoffed, waving off Bram's concerns. Men can be scared. Men can be tricked. Besides, we'll have the element of surprise. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll already be gone. At that moment, an old man sitting nearby leaned over, his weathered face lined with worry. "Boys," he said gruffly, "you don't know what you're messing with. Those guards are not ordinary soldiers. They're trained killers. If you cross them, you'll regret it." Finn laughed dismissively. "Oh, come on, old-timer. You've been listening to too many stories. We're smarter than them. We'll hit fast and hard, then disappear into the woods. They won't stand a chance." The old man shook his head, muttering something under his breath before returning to his drink. But his warning fell on deaf ears. The trio was too caught up in their own excitement to listen. To them, this wasn't just a scheme. It was destiny. This was their chance to prove everyone wrong, to show the world that they weren't just bumbling fools. They were destined for greatness. As the night wore on, the plan grew more elaborate. Finn suggested using nets to trap the guards' horses, while Bram proposed bringing clubs and knives to intimidate them. Rolf, ever the self-proclaimed genius, insisted they wear masks to hide their identities. "No one will recognize us," he declared confidently. "By the time they figure it out, we'll be miles away, counting our gold." Their confidence soared with every passing minute. The ale flowed freely, fueling their bravado. They imagined themselves lounging in luxury, laughing at the foolish guards who had let them slip away. Nothing could go wrong, not when they were so clever. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, reality began to creep in. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the rain picked up, battering the windows. Somewhere deep down, each of them felt a twinge of doubt. Still, none of them voiced it. Instead, they raised their mugs in a toast, sealing their fates with a cheer. "To riches," Finn shouted. "To freedom," Bram added. "And to proving everyone wrong," Rolf finished, slamming his mug onto the table. Little did they know, their reckless plan would lead them straight into the hands of the very people they thought they could outsmart. The king's guards weren't just skilled warriors. They were patient hunters. And once provoked, they never forgot a face. The day of the ambush arrived, and the trio set out before dawn, their hearts pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. They had spent the previous night going over their plan one last time, convincing themselves that everything would go smoothly. Armed with crude weapons, sticks, rocks, and a rusty dagger they'd borrowed from a farmer, they made their way to the forest road. The narrow path wound through dense trees, creating an ideal hiding spot. Finn took charge, positioning Bram and Rolf behind thick bushes on either side of the trail. "Remember," he whispered sharply, "we wait for my signal. Don't move until I say so." Bram nodded eagerly, gripping his club tightly, while Rolf adjusted his makeshift mask, a scarf tied awkwardly around his face. Both tried to steady their breathing as the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. When the caravan finally appeared, their confidence wavered. Instead of the modest escort they had imagined, 6 royal guards rode alongside the wagon, their crimson uniforms glowing faintly in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Each guard carried a gleaming sword at their side, and their posture radiated authority. The sight sent a chill down Finn's spine, but it was too late to back out now. "Stick to the plan," Finn muttered under his breath, trying to mask his growing unease. As the wagon rolled closer, he gave the signal, a sharp whistle, and chaos erupted. The 3 idiots burst from their hiding spots, shouting wildly and waving their weapons like madmen. For a brief moment, confusion reigned. The horses whinnied in alarm, and the driver pulled back on the reins, bringing the caravan to a sudden halt. But the guards didn't panic, not even for a second. With practiced precision, they dismounted, drawing their swords in one fluid motion. Their movements were calm, almost graceful, as if they had anticipated this exact scenario. Finn froze mid-shout, suddenly realizing how hopelessly outmatched they were. Bram, still gripping his club, lunged forward with a roar, but his bravado lasted only until the nearest guard sidestepped effortlessly and delivered a single punch to his gut. Bram crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Rolf fared no better. Convinced he could bluff his way out, he brandished his rusty dagger and shouted, "One step closer and I'll stab you." His voice trembled, betraying his fear. The guard facing him simply raised an eyebrow, then flicked the dagger out of Rolf's hand with the tip of his sword. Within seconds, Rolf found himself pinned against a tree, struggling futilely as the guard bound his hands with rope. Meanwhile, Finn tried to make a run for it, abandoning his companions without a second thought. But he hadn't taken more than a few steps before another guard intercepted him, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him back. "Not so fast," the guard said coolly, tying him up alongside Rolf and the groaning Bram. It was over almost as quickly as it began. The trio sat defeated, their grand plan crumbling into dust. The guards exchanged amused glances, clearly unimpressed by the pathetic display. Captain Irinder, the leader of the escort, stepped forward, his piercing gaze scanning the would-be thieves. "You really thought you could rob the king's gold?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Finn opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. All three hung their heads in shame, the weight of their failure sinking in. What had seemed like a clever scheme just hours ago now felt like the stupidest decision they'd ever made. And as the guards loaded them onto the wagon beside the very treasure they had tried to steal, one thing became painfully clear. They had messed with the wrong people. The journey back to the capital was nothing short of miserable for Finn, Bram, and Rolf. Bound tightly with rope, they were forced to sit on the hard wooden floor of the wagon, surrounded by the very gold they had tried to steal. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here they were, inches away from wealth beyond their wildest dreams, yet completely powerless to claim it. Every bump in the road sent jolts of pain through their bodies, and the guards' laughter didn't help matters. Captain Irinder, the leader of the escort, seemed particularly amused by their plight. "So," he said casually as the wagon rumbled along, "what exactly did you plan to do with all this gold once you got it? Buy a castle? Start your own kingdom?" His voice carried a mocking edge that made Finn's cheeks burn with humiliation. Rolf, ever defiant despite his predicament, shot back, "We'd have been fine if it weren't for you lot showing up. You ruined everything." Irinder chuckled darkly. "Oh, I'm sure you would have been just fine, until the next patrol caught you, or until someone recognized your sorry faces in town. Did you really think you could pull this off without consequences?" Bram groaned, shifting uncomfortably. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by exhaustion and regret. "Can we at least walk instead of sitting here like sacks of potatoes?" he mumbled, earning a sharp kick from one of the guards. "No," Irinder replied firmly. "You wanted the gold so badly. Now you can carry it all the way back to the palace." The trio exchanged horrified glances. Carry the gold on foot. The thought was almost unbearable. But true to his word, when the group reached the outskirts of the forest, the guards untied their ropes, not to set them free, but to hand them heavy chests filled with coins. Each chest weighed far more than any of them had anticipated, and within minutes their arms trembled under the strain. As they trudged along dirt paths under the blazing sun, the guards kept a close watch, occasionally barking orders to keep moving. "Faster!" one shouted when Finn stumbled, nearly dropping his load. Do you want to explain to the king why you're late delivering his gold? Every step felt like torture. Sweat poured down their faces, their legs ached, and blisters formed on their hands from gripping the rough handles of the chests. The guards, meanwhile, rode comfortably on horseback, sipping water from leather flasks and exchanging jokes at the trio's expense. You know, Irindor called out during one particularly grueling stretch, "This is what happens when idiots try to play heroes. Your plan wasn't just stupid, it was insulting. Did you honestly believe you could outwit the king's finest?" Finn gritted his teeth, refusing to respond. Inside, though, doubt gnawed at him. Had they truly been that foolish? He glanced at Bram, who was dragging his feet, and Rolf, whose face was red with exertion. Neither looked like the cunning masterminds they'd pretended to be back at the tavern. By the time they reached the capital, the trio was utterly spent. Their clothes were soaked with sweat, their muscles screamed in protest, and their pride lay in tatters. Villagers stared as they passed, whispering among themselves about the bedraggled thieves struggling to carry the king's treasure. It was the ultimate humiliation. When they finally arrived at the palace gates, Captain Irindor dismounted and approached them, his expression stern. "This is where your real punishment begins," he said. "But remember this, every step you took carrying those chests was a lesson. Respect the law, respect authority, or suffer the consequences." For the first time, none of them argued. As they stood there, exhausted and defeated, they began to realize the gravity of their actions. This wasn't just about stealing gold. It was about challenging a system designed to protect everyone, including people like them. And now, they would face the full weight of justice for their reckless choices. The dungeons beneath the palace were cold, damp, and suffocating. The air smelled of mildew and old stone, and the faint drip of water echoed endlessly through the narrow corridors. Finn, Bram, and Rolf sat huddled together in a cramped cell, their bodies still aching from the long march carrying the heavy chests of gold. Their spirits were lower than ever. Defeat weighed heavily on them, not just because they had been caught, but because they now faced the possibility of death for their crimes. "This is it," Rolf muttered bitterly, leaning against the cold wall. "We're going to rot down here. Or worse," Bram added glumly. "They'll probably chop off our heads or something." Finn didn't respond. He stared at the floor, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about schemes or shortcuts. Instead, he replayed every decision that had led them to this moment. The reckless plan, the arrogance, the refusal to listen to warnings. It all seemed so stupid now. Their gloomy silence was interrupted when heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. A guard appeared, unlocking the cell door with a loud clank. "On your feet," he barked. "The king wants to see you." "The king?" Bram squeaked, his eyes wide with panic. "What does he want with us?" No one answered as they were marched through the dimly lit passages and up a spiraling staircase into the grand halls of the palace. The contrast between the dungeon and the opulence of the throne room was staggering. Golden chandeliers hung from high ceilings, intricate tapestries adorned the walls, and sunlight streamed through towering stained-glass windows. At the center of it all sat King Aldrich himself, an imposing figure with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Beside him stood Captain Irindor, arms crossed, watching the trio with an unreadable expression. "Approach," the king commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. The three shuffled forward nervously, avoiding his gaze. King Aldrich studied them for a moment before speaking. "You trespassed on royal property, attacked my guards, and attempted to steal from me. Such actions are punishable by death." His words sent a shiver down their spines. "But I am curious. What drove 3 men to commit such folly? Speak." Firm nudged Bram, who stammered, We wanted to be rich." Months of rigorous training had transformed Finn, Bram, and Rolf in ways they never thought possible. Gone were the days of lounging in taverns, dreaming up half-baked schemes. Now their lives revolved around discipline, duty, and the unyielding standards of the royal army. Though they still stumbled occasionally, literally, in Bram's case, they were no longer the bumbling idiots who had once tried to rob a king's caravan. They were soldiers, clad in simple uniforms, and learning to fight for something bigger than themselves. Their first real test came sooner than expected. News spread through the barracks that a band of marauders had crossed the northern border, raiding villages and leaving destruction in their wake. The king's forces were mobilized immediately, and to everyone's surprise, including their own. The trio was assigned to join the front lines. Captain Arinder made it clear. This was their chance to prove their worth. "Don't embarrass me," he warned as they prepared for battle. "Or yourselves." The march to the conflict zone was tense. The air grew colder as they ventured farther north, and the cheerful chatter of recruits. As the months turned into years, Finn, Bram, and Rolf continued to rise through the ranks of the royal army. What had started as reluctant service born out of desperation had become a calling they embraced with surprising determination. The lessons they learned in training, discipline, teamwork, and loyalty were no longer just words but principles that guided their actions. They weren't perfect. Old habits occasionally surfaced, like Rolf's tendency to overcomplicate simple orders or Finn's occasional shortcuts. But those flaws were tempered by their growth, earning them respect among their peers. Their bond with Captain Arinder also evolved. At first, he had been nothing more than the stern leader who had captured them and dragged them before the king. Now, he was a mentor, pushing them to be better soldiers and better men. He didn't go easy on them, often assigning them the toughest tasks or putting them in charge of rookie recruits. Yet, there were moments when his gruff exterior softened. After particularly challenging missions, he'd offer quiet praise or share stories from his own days as a young recruit. "You're not half bad. For idiots," he'd say with a rare smirk, and they'd know it was his way of showing pride. The trio's camaraderie extended beyond Arinder to the rest of the guards. Once seen as outsiders, they now stood shoulder to shoulder with men and women they once envied or feared. Shared battles forged unbreakable bonds. Soldiers who had once mocked their clumsiness now relied on them in combat. Finn's quick thinking saved lives during ambushes. Bram's strength held the line against overwhelming odds, and Rolf's knack for spotting traps kept their units safe. Slowly but surely, the idiots earned their place within the ranks. One evening, after a long day of patrol, the group gathered around a fire outside the barracks. Laughter filled the air as soldiers swapped tales of past adventures and near misses. Someone brought up the infamous ambush gone wrong, and instead of jeering at the trio, the others teased them good-naturedly. "Remember how you thought you could take us all down?" One guard chuckled, nudging Rolf. "What were you planning to do with that rusty dagger?" Rolf grinned sheepishly. "Hey, it worked in my head." The laughter died down as Captain Arinder approached, carrying a jug of ale. He poured himself a mug and took a seat beside the fire. For a moment, no one spoke. They rarely saw him so relaxed. Finally, he broke the silence. "When I first met these three," he began, gesturing toward Finn, Bram, and Rolf, "I thought they were hopeless, foolish, arrogant, and completely unfit for duty." Finn winced, expecting another lecture. But Arinder wasn't done. "And yet here we are. They've proven themselves time and again, not because they're natural-born fighters, but because they refuse to give up. That takes guts." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. No one had ever called them courageous before, not even themselves. It was a turning point, not just for the trio, but for the entire unit. From that night on, the teasing stopped entirely, replaced by genuine friendship. The idiots were no longer outsiders. They were part of the family. Over time, they became symbols of redemption within the army. New recruits heard their story and drew inspiration from it. If three reckless fools could transform into respected soldiers, then anyone could change their path if they were willing to work for it. Even King Aldrich took notice, promoting them to senior positions within the ranks. Their journey from criminals to commanders was complete, but more importantly, they had found purpose. Late one night, as the kingdom slept peacefully under a blanket of stars, Finn looked out over the palace walls. Beside him stood Bram and Rolf, both quiet for once. "Do you think we'll ever stop being called idiots?" Finn asked with a wry smile. "Probably not," Rolf replied, shrugging. "But honestly, I don't mind anymore." Bram nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we may have started as idiots, but we're the king's idiots now." They shared a laugh, the sound echoing softly into the night. Despite everything they'd been through, the mistakes, the hardships, the doubts, they wouldn't trade this life for anything. They had finally found where they belonged, guarding the realm, protecting its people, and standing tall as defenders of the crown. Years passed, and the once reckless trio, Finn, Bram, and Rolf, became legends in their own right. Their story wasn't just whispered in taverns anymore. It was told with pride by villagers, soldiers, and even bards who traveled from town to town singing songs of their redemption. The tale of three foolish thieves turned loyal guardians inspired countless others, proving that even those who start as failures can rise to greatness if they're willing to change. Their roles within the royal army evolved too. Finn's sharp mind earned him a position as a strategist, crafting battle plans that outsmarted enemies far more experienced than himself. His quick thinking saved lives on numerous occasions, earning him respect not only among his comrades, but also from the king himself. Bram, with his unmatched strength and newfound discipline, became a shield-bearer, a protector who stood at the front lines, ensuring no harm came to those behind him. And Rolf, though still prone to overthinking, he found his niche as a scout, using his keen eye to spot dangers before anyone else could. Together, they formed an unstoppable team, each complementing the other's strengths. When King Aldrich grew old and passed away, his successor, a young queen named Alara, took the throne. She inherited a kingdom strengthened by peace and unity, thanks in part to the tireless efforts of her father's guards. During her coronation ceremony, she honored Finn, Bram, and Rolf personally, promoting them to senior commanders of the royal army. Standing tall in their crimson uniforms adorned with gold insignias, they felt a surge of pride unlike anything they'd ever known. But their journey didn't end there. As leaders, they took on new responsibilities, training recruits and instilling in them the same values they had learned: loyalty, courage, and humility. They often reminded the younger soldiers of where they had started, not to boast, but to remind them that everyone makes mistakes. "It's not about where you begin," Finn would say during training sessions. "It's about what you do after you fall." Bram added his own wisdom, simple yet profound. "Strength isn't just about muscles or swords. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." And Rolf, ever the thinker, chimed in with a rare moment of clarity. "Plans fail, people mess up, but giving up is the only real failure." Their words resonated deeply with the recruits, many of whom looked up to them as role models. Even Captain Arindur, now retired and living quietly near the palace, visited occasionally to share stories of their early days. "Never forget where you came from," he'd tell them with a grin, "but don't let it define you either." As the years went on, the kingdom faced new challenges: droughts, border disputes, and occasional raids. But the trio led their forces with unwavering resolve. Villagers often spoke of how safe they felt knowing Finn, Bram, and Rolf were watching over them. Children ran up to them in markets, asking for tales of battles fought and won. Merchants tipped their hats in gratitude, remembering how these men had once been troublemakers, but were now pillars of the community. On quiet nights, when the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, the three would gather atop the palace walls, just as they had done years ago. They reflected on how far they'd come, from bumbling idiots dreaming of stolen gold to respected commanders defending the realm. Life hadn't always been kind to them, but through perseverance and purpose, they had carved out a legacy worth remembering. "You know," Finn said one evening, breaking the comfortable silence, We might have started as fools, but we ended up exactly where we were meant to be. Bram chuckled, leaning back against the stone wall. Yeah, who would have thought? Rolf smiled, gazing out at the peaceful kingdom below. Maybe being idiots wasn't such a bad thing after all. It got us here. And so, under the watchful eyes of the stars, the trio stood together, guardians of the realm, protectors of the innocent, and proof that even the most unlikely heroes can find their place in the world. Their story wasn't just one of redemption. It was a testament to the power of second chances, hard work, and believing in something greater than oneself. For Finn, Bram, and Rolf, life had come full circle. What began as a reckless scheme had transformed into a lifetime of service, honor, and belonging. And though they still joked about their idiotic past, they wore their crimson uniforms with pride, forever loyal to the kingdom and the crown they had once tried to defy.